Military history. 1914 to 1918. For the general student of history, the military history of the First World War is not merely the narration of advancing armies, the struggles of men, their deaths, triumphs or defeats. Rather, it presents an extraordinary discrepancy between the facts of modern warfare and the ideas on military tactics which dominated the minds of men, especially the minds of military men. This discrepancy existed for many years before the war and began to disappear only in the course of 1918. As a result of its existence, the first 3 years of the war witnessed the largest military casualties in human history. These occurred as a result of the efforts of military men to do things which were quite impossible to do. The German victories of 1866 and 1870 were the result of theoretical study, chiefly by the General Staff, and exhaustive, detailed training resulting from that study. They were emphatically not based on experience, for the army of 1866 had had no actual fighting experience for 2 generations, and was commanded by a leader, Helmuth von Moltke, who had never commanded a unit so large as a company previously. Moltke's great contribution was to be found in the fact that, by using the railroad and the telegraph, he was able to merge mobilization and attack into a single operation, so that the final concentration of his forces took place in the enemy country, practically on the battlefield itself, just before contact with the main enemy forces took place. This contribution of Moltke's was accepted and expanded by Count von Schlieffen, Chief of the General Staff from 1891 to 1905. Schlieffen considered it essential to overwhelm the enemy in one great initial onslaught. He assumed that Germany would be outnumbered and economically smothered in any fighting of extended duration, and sought to prevent this by a lightning war of an exclusively offensive character. He assumed that the next war would be a 2-front war against France and Russia simultaneously, and that the former would have to be annihilated before the latter was completely mobilized. Above all, he was determined to preserve the existing social structure of Germany, especially the superiority of the Junker class. Accordingly, he rejected either an enormous mass army, in which the Junker control of the officers' corps would be lost by simple lack of numbers, or a long-drawn war of resources and attrition, which would require a reorganized German economy. The German emphasis on attack was shared by the French army command, but in a much more extreme and even mystical fashion. Under the influence of Ardent de Picq and Ferdinand Foch, the French General Staff came to believe that victory depended only on attack, and that the success of any attack depended on morale and not on any physical factors. Dupic went so far as to insist that victory did not depend at all on physical assault or on casualties, because the former never occurs and the latter occurs only during flight after the defeat. According to him, victory was a matter of morale, and went automatically to the side with the higher morale. The sides charge at each other. There is never any shock of attack, because one side breaks and flees before impact. This break is not the result of casualties, because the flight occurs before casualties are suffered, and always begins in the rear ranks, where no casualties could be suffered. The casualties are suffered in the flight and pursuit after the break. Thus the whole problem of war resolves itself into the problem of how to screw up the morale of one's army to the point where it is willing to fling itself headlong on the enemy. Technical problems of equipment or maneuvers are of little importance. These ideas of Dupic were accepted by an influential group in the French army as the only possible explanation of the French defeat in 1870. This group, led by Foch, propagated throughout the army the doctrine of morale and the offensive à outrance. Foch became professor at the École Supérieure de Guerre in 1894, and his teaching could be summed up in the 4 words: attaquer, attaquer, toujours attaquer. This emphasis on the offensive à outrance by both sides led to a concentration of attention on 3 factors which were obsolete by 1914. These 3 were cavalry, the bayonet, and the headlong infantry assault. These were obsolete in 1914 as the result of 3 technical innovations: rapid-fire guns, especially machine guns, barbed wire entanglements, and trench warfare. The orthodox military leaders generally paid no attention to the 3 innovations, while concentrating all their attention on the 3 obsolete factors. Foch, from his studies of the Russo-Japanese War, decided that machine guns and barbed wire were of no importance, and ignored completely the role of trenches. Although cavalry was obsolete for assault by the time of the Crimean War, a fact indicated in Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigades, and although this was clearly demonstrated to be so in the American Civil War, a fact explicitly recognized in the Army and Navy Journal for October 31st, 1868, cavalry and cavalry officers continued to dominate armies and military preparations. During the war of 1914 to 1918, many commanding officers, like John French, Douglas Haig, and John J. Pershing, were cavalry officers and retained the mentality of such officers. Haig, in his testimony before the Royal Commission on the War in South Africa 1903, testified, "Cavalry will have a larger sphere of action in future wars." Pershing insisted on the necessity to keep large numbers of horses behind the lines, waiting for the breakthrough which was to be obtained by bayonet charge. In every army, transportation was one of the weakest points, yet feed for the horses was the largest item transported, being greater than ammunition or other supplies. Although transport across the Atlantic was critically short throughout the war, 1/3 of all shipping space was in feed for horses. Time for training recruits was also a critical bottleneck, but most armies spent more time on bayonet practice than on anything else. Yet casualties inflicted on the enemy by bayonet were so few that they hardly appear in the statistics dealing with the subjects. The belief of military men that an assault made with high morale could rail through wire, machine guns, and trenches was made even more unrealistic by their insistence that such an offensive unit maintain a straight front. This meant that it was not to be permitted to move further in a soft spot, but was to hold back where advance was easy, in order to break down the defensive strong points, so that the whole front could proceed at approximately the same rate. This was done, they explained, in order to avoid exposed flanks and enemy crossfire on advanced salients. There was some opposition to these unrealistic theories, especially in the German army, and there were important civilians in all countries who fought with their own military leaders on these issues. Clemenceau in France, and above all Lord Esher and the members of the Committee on Imperial Defence in England should be mentioned here. At the outbreak of war in August 1914, both sides began to put into effect their complicated strategic plans made much earlier. On the German side, this plan, known as the Schlieffenplan, was drawn up in 1905 and modified by the younger Helmut von Moltke, nephew of the Moltke of 1870, after 1906. On the French side, the plan was known as Plan 17 and was drawn up by Joffre in 1912. The original Schlieffen plan proposed to hold the Russians, as best as could be done, with 10 divisions, and to face France with a stationary left wing of 8 divisions and a great wheeling right and centre of 53 divisions going through Holland and Belgium and coming down on the flank and rear of the French armies by passing west of Paris. Moltke modified this by adding 2 divisions to the right wing, 1 from the Russian front and 1 new, and 8 new divisions to the left. He also cut out the passage through Holland, making it necessary for his right wing to pass through the Liège gap, between the Maastricht appendix of Holland and the forested terrain of the Ardennes. The French Plan 17 proposed to stop an anticipated German attack into eastern France from Lorraine by an assault of 2 enlarged French armies on its centre, thus driving victoriously into southern Germany, whose Catholic and separatist peoples were not expected to rally with much enthusiasm to the Protestant centralist cause of a Prussianized German Empire. While this was taking place, a force of 800,000 Russians was to invade East Prussia, and 150,000 British were to bolster the French left wing near Belgium. The execution of these plans did not completely fulfill the expectations of their supporters. The French moved 3,781,000 men in 7,000 trains in 16 days, August the 2nd to 18, opening their attack on Lorraine on August the 14th. By August the 20th, they were shattered, and by August the 25th, after 11 days of combat, had suffered 300,000 casualties. This was almost 25% of the number of men engaged, and represented the most rapid wastage of the war. In the meantime, the Germans in 7 days, August 6th to 12th, transported 1,500,000 men across the Rhine at the rate of 550 trains a day. These men formed 70 divisions divided into 7 armies, and forming a vast arc from northwest to southeast. Within this arc were 49 French divisions organized in 5 armies, and the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, of 4 divisions. The relationship of these forces, the commanding generals of their respective armies, and the relative strength can be seen from the following list. Now he draws a list. We will just read it because of the fancy surnames of the commanders. So the Entente forces north to south, commanders were Sir John French, Lanrezac, Delangle de Cary, Ruffy, Castelnau-du-Bel. German forces north to south, commanders von Kluck, von Below, von Hausen, Prince Albrecht von Württemberg, Crown Prince Frederick, Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, and von Heringen. The German right wing passed Liège without reducing that great fortress on the night of August 5 to 6 under the instructions of General Erich Ludendorff of the General Staff. The Belgian army, instead of retreating southwestward before the German wave, moved northwestward to cover Antwerp. This put them ultimately on the rear of the advancing German forces. These forces peeled off 8.5 divisions to reduce the Belgian forts and 7 divisions to cover the Belgian force before Antwerp. This reduced the strength of the German right wing, which was increasingly exhausted by the rapidity of its own advance. When the German plan became clear on August the 18th, Joffre formed a new Sixth Army, largely from garrison troops, under Michel-Joseph Meunery, but really commanded by Joseph Gallieni, military governor of Paris. By August the 22nd, the whole French line west of Verdun was in retreat. 3 days later, Moltke, believing victory secure, sent 2 army corps to Russia from the 2nd and 3rd armies. These arrived on the eastern front only after the Russian advance into Prussia had been smashed at Tannenberg and around the Masurian Lakes, August 26th to September 15th. In the meantime, in the west, Schlieffen's project swept onward towards Fiesque. When Lanrezac slowed up Below's advance on August the 29th, Kluck, who was already a day's march ahead of Below, tried to close the gap between the two by turning southeastward. This brought his line of advance east of Paris rather than west of that city as originally planned. Gallieni, bringing the Sixth Army from Paris in any vehicles he could commander, threw it at Kluck's exposed right flank. Kluck turned again to face Gallieni, moving northeastward in a brilliant maneuver in order to envelop him within the German arc before resuming his advance southeastward. This operation was accompanied by considerable success, except that it opened gap 30 miles wide between Kluck and Below. Opposite this gap was the BEF, which was withdrawing southward with even greater speed than the French. On September the 5th, the French retreat stopped. On the following day, they began a general counterattack, ordered by Joffre on the insistence of Gallieni. Thus began the First Battle of the Marne. Kluck was meeting with considerable success over the 6th French army, although Below was being badly mauled by Lanrezac. When the BEF began to move into the gap between the 1st and 2nd German armies, September the 9th, a German staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, ordered the whole German right to fall back to the Ain River, where a front was formed on September the 13th by the arrival of some of the German forces which had been attacking the Belgian forts. The Germans were willing to fall back on the Aisne, it is written, because they believed the advance could be resumed when they wished to do so. In the next few months, the Germans tried to resume their advance, and the French tried to dislodge the Germans from their positions. Neither was able to make any headway against the firepower of the other. A succession of futile efforts to outflank each other's positions merely succeeded in bringing the end of the front to the English Channel on one extreme and to Switzerland on the other. In spite of millions of casualties, this line, from the sea to the mountains, across the fair face of France, remained almost unchanged for over 3 years.